to you all. I'm Peter Jennings. For those of you who don't know me, Executive Director of ASPI for about 24 more hours. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce to you Kevin Rudd, a man who clearly does not need an introduction to an audience like this in a town like this, but I'll introduce Kevin anyway. Kevin became President and CEO of the Asia Society in January of 2021. And he's been president of the Asia Society Policy Institute since January 2015, or as we like to think of it, the other ASPI, Kevin. So I think for the first time ever, actually, we have the heads of the two global ASPIs present in front of you. Kevin, of course, served as Australia's 26th Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010, then as Foreign Minister from 2010 to 12, before returning as Prime Minister in 2013. Kevin is also a leading international authority on China. He began his career as a China scholar, serving as an Australian diplomat in Beijing before entering Australian politics. And Kevin has most recently authored a book called The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China, which is available for sale after Kevin finishes speaking. So those of you who would like a copy, you'll be able to get one outside, and he may even sign it for you if you're very lucky. So the way we're going to work this is Kevin's going to make some brief introductory remarks, then we'll have a conversation between the two of us, and then I'll bring you into for questions and answers about 10 minutes or so before we finish around about 3:30. And with that, Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's always good to be back in the nation's capital. And it's a good opportunity to publicly acknowledge Peter's work as head of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, an institution which has enjoyed bipartisan support for a very long time. And so we wish you well. Thank you for your contribution and the realist strategic ballast which you have provided to the national security conversation of Australia. I'm sorry for my voice. I've been out flogging my book in the retail stakes and on the campaign hustings doing other more disgraceful things. And as a result, I sound a bit like Mae West this morning. Or as someone said to me at the last gathering I addressed, you might sound like Mae West, but you don't look like Mae West. So, let me in the next 10 to 15 minutes just do two things. One, explain why I've penned a book like this. Two, go to its essential argument in terms of Xi Jinping's strategic worldview. And three, how does the United States in particular respond through what I describe as an argument called managed strategic competition. So why write the book? I've lived and worked in the United States now, basically since coming second in the 2013 elections. That meant I lost, Steve. And our friends at Harvard asked me to come and do some work on US-China relations and what Xi Jinping would mean for second-term Obama. Then, of course, we saw the election of Trump, and we've seen now the election of Biden. But if you trace carefully the rise of Xi Jinping's China, there has been a certain strategic relentlessness to the ambition and to the operation and to the strategy. Secondly, in the United States, there is often a lot of sound on the question of how to deal strategically with China's rise, and not often a lot of strategic coherence about how to deal with China's rise. And by strategic coherence, I mean a worldview which effectively integrates what's going on in Chinese domestic politics, the domestic drivers of China's external strategic behavior, as well as what is happening in the external domain, both in foreign policy and in straight, hard security policy, as well as in other domains as well. So, and if there's a third reason for writing it, I've always been haunted by that book by Chris Clark. I don't know if you've read it, The Sleepwalkers. Written, I think, in about 2015, as it describes the failed diplomacy of June, July, August 1914, and how we collectively slept walk into the war to end all wars and left 60 million people dead around the world and changed geopolitics forever. In fact, when I reflect on the history, there seem to be 2 or 3 enduring principles to reflect on. One is sleepwalking, or shall I say, the failure of diplomacy in 1914. The second, because the First World War was entirely avoidable. If you look at the complex developments of July of 1914, no one wanted a war. No one believed that a war was inevitable. But once the mobilization process has started, as Keegan has outlined in his monumental history of the First World War, it was unstoppable. And the rest, as they say, is history. So I'm haunted by the sleepwalkers and the failure of diplomacy at a critical time. The second is the lessons of a generation later, which is the lesson of appeasement. And if you look at the untidy history of Europe, really from 36 to 39, and arguably a little earlier than that, one series of acts of appeasement giving rise to another and causing the dictators of the time to reach a conclusion that you could continue to salami slice Europe and ultimately the world. And partly because of the aftershock of the great carnage of the First World War, then we collectively engaged in appeasement. Governments in the United Kingdom, to some extent the United States, and certainly in this country as well. And the rest, as they say, is history. And the third principle for me is kind of where what we learnt as an international security community following the near-death experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And what happened after 62 when the world came quite close to blowing each other's brains out, with potentially, as Kennedy says in his memoir, 100 million dead. The paramount importance of deterrence, the paramount importance of diplomacy in navigating the very untidy period post-Cold War through to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which brought us close to the precipice once or twice in terms of nukes, but by and large a series of what I would describe as strategic rules of the road emerged, which were capable of providing a level of strategic stability in the midst of a monumental superpower conflict, usually conducted through proxy wars around the rest of the world. So reflecting on those 3 things, I've sought to apply... Yes. Oh, good. Something went wrong, please try again. So as I reflect on those 3 principles, what have I done, therefore, in this book? A large part of the book is a description of how we got to where we've got to with Xi Jinping and the United States. As you, men and women involved in the strategic policy community of this country know full well, the underlying axiomatic change has been the change in the balance of power. China is populated by an entire culture of strategic realists. You don't have to just read the classical literature, you read the contemporary literature as well. They monitor what they describe as 综合国力, comprehensive national power, as if it's something you pick up on the packet of your rice bubbles in the morning packet. They make a rolling calculus in terms of their power and all the subcategories of power when measured against the United States and its allies. The second reason we are where we are is because since 2012, Xi Jinping has turbocharged the foreign and policy and external policy articulation of that changing balance within. And you don't have to be a forensic sinologist to look at the change in the pattern of ideological language used in Xi's domestic discourse to see, as the balance of power rises, we Chinese can therefore assert more power in the region and the world. It is as blunt as that when you rip it back to its ideological primaries. And thirdly, since second term Obama, certainly since the Trump administration's declaration of the new national security strategy of November 2017, and now what has been, frankly, a sustained framework around similar principles since Biden's election, you have an American pushback, and for the first time, effectively in partnership with allies. The other element of this book tries to explain what Xi Jinping is now doing. It outlines what I describe as 10 concentric circles of political and strategic interest. The reason for describing it in those terms is not because the Communist Party used that phraseology. They don't. The Chinese Communist Party and its discussion of these matters is driven by principles of opacity and when it comes to external audiences. But if you study the entrails and pull it apart, as regrettably I'm now required to do and read all this stuff, and the think tank which I lead, it again becomes fairly clear. And the 10 are pretty simple. 1, maintain the power of the party, and my role, Xi Jinping, in charge of the party for the long term as a Leninist enterprise. Not the short term, not some transition to something else, as may have been the case with Deng Zhang and Hu. 2, the paramount importance of national unity, whether it's Xinjiang or the recovery of Taiwan, which is now on railway tracks in Xi Jinping's mind to be executed by one means or another before 2049, and in my judgment, before 2035. 3, continue to grow the economy in order to sustain legitimacy with rising living standards, and also to do so in a manner which increases China's national economic power and global economic footprint, in order to underpin what Xi describes elsewhere as the global gravitational pull of the Chinese economy towards corporations and nations around the world, both in trade, investment, and in technology. 4, do the above sustainably, because there's a massive domestic reaction against unconditional economic development through its impact on water pollution, land pollution, and air pollution, the quality of food, and your ability to breathe clean air. And that trips its way into climate change action by the particulate matter concentration in China's major cities. 5, keep the neighboring states under control and ultimately make them benign and then compliant. 周边国家外交. And if you look at his first text on security policy and foreign policy back in 2013, that's what it was all about. That's where he announced formally, by omission, at the end of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead, and adopted a new posture of a more assertive policy. 6, push the Americans out of maritime East Asia, whether it's through the treaty partnerships with Korea and Japan over time, and weakening those with other security partners, namely Thailand and the Philippines, and deal with the Australians as best you can. That's their worldview. And of course, that is all dictated by a Taiwan scenario. 7, move to the Western periphery across the Eurasian continent through the Belt and Road Initiative plus other measures to turn that into a benign strategic corridor for China in a way in which historically it has never been. And that's where the Russia relationship is actually central. Having normalized the border with the Ruskies between 89 and 91, frankly, the geopolitics post-72 with Nixon and Kissinger was turned on its head as the normalization of Russia-China relations made it possible for China to turn elsewhere against the United States in maritime East Asia. 8 is beyond these zones to the east and to the west, across the continental periphery and across the maritime periphery. There is also China's posture in the rest of the world, where the single organizing principle is to make China the indispensable economic partner in Latin America, in Africa, in the rest of Asia, and our friends in Europe as well. China regards Europe as strategically soft. They regard it as not being robust. They're a little concerned about what Olaf Scholz, the new Social Democratic Chancellor in Berlin, has done most recently in response to the Ukraine. They're also concerned about what the Scandies are now doing, or the Nordics are now doing with Finland and Sweden, both under social democratic governments, turning hard right and seeking perhaps to join NATO. The Chinese are looking at that carefully, but ultimately they believe the Europeans are soft. And they see that as consistent with their broader strategy across the world. And finally, let me turn to what China is now doing with the global rules-based order. You don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to sit in New York and work out what's happening each day in the UN General Assembly, what's happening in the Security Council, what's happening in the UN specialized agencies, what's happening in global negotiations on standard settings for new technologies. China, if you have in your mind the analogy of what China now does with its fishing fleets in the South China Sea and their deployment against the Philippines, that's what China now does in international conferences. You are overwhelmed by sheer mass and size. As China bit by bit begins to change the normative language of the international system, which we have been part of since 1945, and eventually change the institutions themselves through control over personnel and budget, and over time create your own institutions outside the UN and Bretton Woods framework. I do not see anything that I have seen in the last 9 years which departs from that strategic framework. To conclude, what's the third thing the book does? If you accept the underlying reality of the balance of power dynamics and that things have changed under Xi, and you accept that this is a relatively relentless strategy in its 10 component parts being rolled out against what China has perceived to be a strategically soft US collective West, and certainly that being the case with the Europeans, then what shall be done? So the book outlines what I describe as not a strategy for the United States. That is something which those of us in the think tank community in the United States deal with in other fora. But this is actually recommended as a joint strategic framework for managing the US-China relationship at this time, at this critical juncture, in an entirely realist frame, so as not to have accidental crisis, escalation, conflict, and war, which we are now in an environment where the hard wires of the US-China relationship, almost if you go into a factory floor and see on the concrete a bunch of cabling there where the insulation has been ripped off the cables because there's no politics and diplomacy that's functional anymore. It's just exposed live wires. And for me, that makes me a little worried. So, the managed strategic competition is aimed at doing three things. What are the principles which enable the two sides to negotiate strategic red lines through high diplomacy between the two capitals in 5 subcategories of Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, Korean Peninsula, and cyber/space. 2, in the rest of the relationship, through this framework, engage in non-lethal, full-throttle, full-throated strategic competition across everything else, from the rest of national security policy through foreign policy, through trade, investment, technology, and ideology as well, because the fight is on in terms of the battle for ideas. And third, through the framework, still prescribe and identify some strategic and political space through which to collaborate on the stuff where it's in the interests of both countries to do so. Climate, the next pandemic, because there will be one, given how much we buggered up the last one. And thirdly, the continued stability of the global financial system, where unlike with the Soviet Union, you're faced with the reality of the 2 largest economies of the world now being fulcrum for the stability of the current financial system. So to conclude, that's the argument. We'll go to, in Peter, a conversation about some of its more detailed elements. But as I go and sit down, even in the period of the last Cold War, the Sovs and the United States did agree together around the world to eliminate smallpox. Just remember that in the midst of everything else, you can find some political ground to prosecute a global public good. Thanks very much.
Kevin, thank you, and congratulations on the book. It's 2 years in the making, I understand, and I think very clear And I couldn't in any way disagree with your assessment of what it is that is the sort of essence of Chinese strategy. Now, in the epilogue to the book, you quote a Chinese former vice foreign minister describing the US-China relationship as, and this is the quote, a deeply entrenched tradition of mutually assured misunderstanding between Washington and Beijing. And I don't disagree with that assessment, but it puzzles me because, you know, given the intelligence and policy effort that both sides put into trying to understand each other's intentions, why does that situation prevail?
In my judgment, there is a high degree of mutual understanding about what the underlying strategic cultures of each country now is. And that's the product of 50 years of dealing with each other, since Nixon and Kissinger, and the evolution of it. And at various times, the US and China have worked very closely. Look at the combined efforts against Afghanistan, of the Soviet presence in Afghanistan in the 1970s, and beyond that. So there is a high degree of mutual comprehension, but the two areas where I think there is still a huge gap is as follows. One, when I look at the texts of US national security strategy in Washington and speak to interlocutors in state and Pentagon and elsewhere in the NSC, as I do as part of my job, what is usually missing from the frame are the domestic political drivers of decision-making in Beijing. And frankly, if you reflect on our own country, Australia, domestic politics and political reality and the way in which political actors see their future foreign and security policy actions are not just determined in a rational bubble. There's a huge infiltration of those decisions by domestic Chinese politics. And why that's so important now is as we head towards the 20th Party Congress at the end of this year, Xi Jinping is under a bucket load of domestic political pressure. It may not be surfacing much in the media at the moment. It's slowing economy, COVID stuff-up, overreach in supporting Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, etc. Not so that he will actually lose his job, but there are massive domestic drivers at play. And I often find in the strategic discourse of the United States, it is the domestic component and therefore the domestic levers of, shall we say, influencing the decision, which are usually absent. Remember Kennan's great work in the Long Telegram and in the X article of 46, 47. Brilliant pieces of work, both of which are anchored in a deep analysis of Soviet domestic politics and the future of the CPSU, as the prism through which to then understand, analyse and work out what to do to leverage change in Russia's and Soviet Union's then strategic behaviour. So that's one aspect of it. From the Chinese end, the Chinese calculus is that the United States will always be driven as a bunch of realists by the balance of power. And that when the Americans work out at the end of the day that the balance of power is not going to work for them in the Taiwan Straits, then as rational actors, the United States will then turn around and say, well, bugger me, we just can't do that. So when the balloon goes up, that's bye-bye the US, they won't lift a finger, and therefore you'll see a smooth takeover of Taiwan, like there's been a smooth takeover of Ukraine. Not. And so when you say to the Chinese, as I often do in exchanges with think tanks and with officials and the rest, if the Yanks do that, it's all over Red Rover in terms of the global credibility of the United States strategic undertakings to its Asian and European allies, and that whatever the stakes are, and your calculus and theirs is of the balance of power at the time, this is the end of history moment for the US, if they simply tap the mat, and that's the end. Of course, the Chinese would then say, well, if they don't tap the mat and they engage and they lose, it's double the end of history. I said, well, we can have that discussion, but the bottom line is, what I find in the underlying strategic culture in Beijing is that you continue to leverage the military and economic and technological balance against the United States. You solve the problem of ever having to go to war. You retake Taiwan sometime in the 2030s. They're the two profound misunderstandings which I encounter in each capital.
And related to that, the second of those misunderstandings, the Beijing misunderstandings, is do you think Xi Jinping has created now a system a bit like we see with Putin in the Kremlin, where he's not getting good quality advice? I mean, Putin seems, I think, to have been quite clearly misled by the FSB, Fifth Directorate, as to what was going to happen when the Russian forces went into Ukraine. Xi Jinping's convinced himself of the inevitable decline of the United States. I just wonder if there are people around him who can have frank, tough conversations to suggest course correction if he's getting his policies wrong.
I think prior to 2017 that was the case in the 19th Party Congress. Given the change in the constellation of the central leadership in the last 5 years, I'd say the answer is almost no. On the economy, I know that to be the case because his reform-oriented economic policy team have basically, in my judgment, railed against each of the changes in economic policy settings that we've seen in Beijing in the course of 18, 19, 20 and 21, which I summarise in the book as the structural move of the centre of gravity of Chinese economic policy decision-making to the left. And so people have argued against that, but Xi Jinping, the politician, the grand strategist, the ideologue, has always assumed he knew better. On the question of national security policy, I think there are two friction points within the Chinese system where you can point to alternative advice, but not comprehensively taken. One is the entire Chinese diplomatic establishment, professionally speaking, were, in my judgment, reasonably horrified by wolf warrior diplomacy, because they've been around for a long time. Their axiom was the Chinese translation of how to win friends and influence people. And this was not a good recipe for winning friends and influencing people. So if you notice that the wolf warrior dum has been turned down in volume recently, that's because finally I think the message got through that this was beginning to run absolutely contrary to Chinese interests. But on Ukraine, where every fibre of my being tells me that the professional national security and foreign policy establishment in Beijing would not have supported the 4 February joint declaration between Russia and China. I wrote about this at the time in the piece in the Wall Street Journal. This is before the invasion occurred. So I looked at the text, and then I got out the text of everything else that they'd issued as a joint statement for the previous 20 years. And it's like a graph like this, you know, in terms of mutual love and comradely assistance under all circumstances. Now the hardheads in the policy establishment would have gone because they know that things don't often turn out. So, but Xi Jinping charged ahead, and that's one of the reasons why he has some exposure in the internal debate now, and the other one being the slowing of Chinese economic growth to probably not much north of 4% this year.
Yeah. I can only assume that Putin briefed China into the FSB view, which was that this is going to be easy, so you don't need to worry too much. And that must surely now be being recalculated in terms of Beijing's thinking.
I assume so, and of course none of us know what happened in the corner of the room when Xi Jinping disappeared with Vladimir and with one interpreter apiece, and had their discussion after the dinner in Beijing. It's either the night of the 4th or the night of the 5th. Can't remember which day the Winter Olympics opened. I have never accepted the view that Xi Jinping was blindsided by this, the fact of the invasion, or necessarily the scale. The Chinese embassy in Moscow is a sophisticated operation. I mean, they've got analysts all over the place. And remember, there's a long history of this relationship in good times and in bad. So they've learnt as a system not to just trust everything the Ruskies say to you, because sometimes they lie. I know we should wash our mouths out, but sometimes they really do lie. So my judgment, for what it's worth, Peter, but I have no hard information, no hard intelligence, is that there was no surprise about the fact of the invasion. On the question of these Russian assurances of success, London to a brick, Vladimir said, we'll be in Minsk we'll be in Kiev within the week. And again, the negative feedback loop in the Chinese system around Xi's professional judgment and going out on a limb on this is significant. Though my Russian analytical friends, and I see Paul Dibb here, knows much more about the Soviet Union Russia than I will ever know, or even attempt to know. And they all tell me there's no way that Putin could fall because he's so robust within domestic Russian politics, surrounded by the incrustations of Russian nationalism and the security policy establishment. But if Putin were to fall between now and the 20th Party Congress, it would have a huge impact in what would happen in the 20th Party Congress. Because not only did your man fail in Ukraine, your man, your best buddy, what you say publicly is your best friend in the world, is now purged out of office and gone. Now that would be one of those domestic factors that we touched on before.
Do those outer layers of the Communist Party hierarchy look at Xi Jinping and worry that he is a Putin in the making?
I think they've worried that. I think the internal conclusions about Xi Jinping's domestic political trajectory are clear and have been clear since the 19th Party Congress, and in some respects before, which is maximum concentration of personal power on the part of the leader. Stalin's a good guy again, by the way. Secondly, contract the political space available for independent advice and in people's personal quality of life. Speak to Chinese universities now about the level of non-academic freedom permitted in the classroom. 10 years ago, if you were lecturing at IR, International Relations or Strategic Studies, Peking University or Tsinghua, because I've done that, you can talk about anything 10 years ago. And there was a full access in the library to everything produced by ASPI, despite what the embassy here may say about you, and what is produced around the world. That's not the case anymore. And so there is, among elites, a reaction against that as well, because even if you are a non-America loving, loyal member of the Chinese Communist Party, your view is, I need to be informed about what the world actually thinks. And so I think there is a clear understanding on the part of elites as to where this is headed, which is why, looking at the 20th Party Congress, it's heretical to say it, but I will anyway, because we're in Canberra. I don't see at this stage, absent Putin falling, any terminal danger for Xi Jinping being reappointed as General Secretary. But the thing for us to watch as an analytical community is what happens with the rest of the Chinese leadership. Does Xi Jinping get up the rest of his preferred slate of candidates for the Standing Committee, for the Politburo itself, for the Central Committee? In other words, is there an institutional reaction against this concentration of power in the power of a single man's hand coming as a product of what's happened on the economy and on Russia in particular and on wolf warriors in general, which may lead to a more complex set of political arrangements in Beijing after this November. I put that out there as a question rather than as a prediction, because I think that's where our analytical effort should focus.
Kevin, I'd like to finish on something that's been very much in the centre of Australian thinking recently, and that is, of course, the so-called secret, strangely made public treaty between China and the Solomon Islands. And rather than sort of dig into the guts of politics about that, what I'm interested to hear from you is your thinking around why would China make this approach now? What is the signal that we should be reading about China's intentions in the Pacific more broadly? And how does Australia deal with that?
I wish I had a clear answer to that, because of COVID, I haven't been to Beijing for 2 years. And usually if you're there for a week, you dig in and you find something which gives you an insight in terms of why this and why now. For example, if the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, was seriously in the business of sending out a signal that post the next Australian election, whoever wins, Liberal Party or my party, the Labor Party, that we wanted to, as it were, have an agenda shift. We wanted to have a circuit breaker. I could not have prescribed a worse thing to do. than to say, I know what we're going to do. We're going to announce or have agreed with our new best buddies in Honiara this security pact with the government of the Solomon Islands. It is just politically illiterate for the Chinese party apparatus to have approved that as an approach. Secondly, I think what it does say, however, is that it's a clear insight, in my judgment, to the bifurcation internally of the Chinese system between the Central Military Commission and the Foreign Policy Establishment. Yes. The Central Military Commission is freestanding, makes its own decisions about which, frankly, China's most senior diplomats are informed after the event and given a brief on how to explain to the rest of the world, or, more likely, asked to prepare a brief to explain to the rest of the world. So therefore, I think the key question is, why did the Chinese, not foreign policy establishment, but the national security policy establishment do this at this time? This is speculation. I have no hard information. One possibility is the Jinwei, the CMC, decided that in the post-AUKUS environment, that there would be an opportunity to demonstrate to the Australian government and the Australian political class that, okay, you're going to go down the AUKUS road, and you're going to become a central player in the future struggle, to use the Chinese term, between the United States and China in the East Asia and the West Pacific, what will happen with the future of the submarine fleet, then we're going to demonstrate to you that there are national security consequences. Now, I assume that's a possibility. I do not know that's a possibility. So when anyone reports on this afterwards, this is not me sort of saying that AUKUS was a bad thing or anything. AUKUS, as you know, has bipartisan support from our mob and, of course, the government. I think that's one part of it. I think the other is much more material, and it goes to wargaming. It goes to wargaming about clocks and slocks, and it goes to wargaming over the question of submarine cabling between here in the United States and elsewhere. And so what specifically operationally lies beneath that proposition? There'll be a bunch of very smart people in this room who could tell me, well beyond my pay grade. But I know that the Central Military Commission is always wargaming what happens if the balloon goes up. Because this book goes on to, begins by saying, Peter, is that, in my judgment, there is no such thing as a limited war over Taiwan. You cannot construct a warfighting scenario over Taiwan, which is just a couple of grey ships taking potshots at each other. The preemption in which both sides engage in vis-a-vis Chinese rocket forces around Fujian and the need to take out what is on Guam and possibly on Okinawa as a preemptive strike means that you are into a general war and of catastrophic dimensions, in my judgment. So therefore, in terms of wargaming by the PLA, I assume this is one part of the equation. And the final reason, I suppose, it may also just be, quote, what the PLA does. Look at the string of pearls, and look at what happened in the Indian Ocean over a 20-year period. Boom, 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 boom. Then suddenly Djibouti, well, where did that come from? Then, of course, we've got what's unfolding in East Africa. As China, having read its Mahon, as the Americans describe him, and the pathway to becoming a global power, the Great White Fleet, Teddy Roosevelt, a la Beijing, with Chinese characteristics, that you need a global network of ports and bases which will support the operations of a Chinese global strategic presence. So I think I regard this as a deeply adverse development. Beyond the politics of it and how did it come about and could we have prevented it and everything else, there's a separate set of debates about that. But of itself, the cardinal principle of Australian security policy under Liberal and Labor governments since 1945 has been to secure the 13 island states of the Southwest Pacific from external strategic penetration since we got rid of the Japanese. Okay? And both governments of both persuasions, have done that. But now we have a problem.
Yeah, I think that's a very good assessment. And, on AUKUS, I think it's one of the few things that we, Australia, have been able to do that seems to have genuinely puzzled and worried the Chinese. I'd like to think they were reading, defence press releases on a daily basis, and of course they will be, but there's not much that happens that really shocks them, and I think AUKUS was quite shocking. But your other point is absolutely right too, which is that this is all connected. You know, the idea that you could contain a conflict to just around Taiwan strikes me as impossible. And now we can have a sense that the military actions and effects that might begin to roll out in the prosecution of that campaign could flow as far south as Melanesia. So, you know, I think now what I'd like to do is take a few minutes. We might just eat into 3 or 4 minutes of afternoon tea for you to put some questions to Kevin. So can I ask you to show a hand if you'd like to ask a question, and then just wait for a mic to come to you. And please say who you are.
Cheers. Hi, James Harvey, Defence, second question of the day. I've got a question about your concentric circles. Number one, maintain G and CCP power. Number two, Taiwan. Do you think it's credible that the West, US, could put enough deterrent presence in front of taking Taiwan that Xi would see that as a risk of attempt and fail of taking Taiwan, and that could subsequently risk his first priority, which is maintaining domestic power? And if that's so, I guess the viability of that as a course of action, rather than it just being seen as a chance to escalate tensions.
Absolutely. In fact, I own that logic within the text of the book, which is in terms of managed strategic competition. I argue, what's in it for the Chinese? If you're sitting in Beijing and reading Uncle Kevin's book, why would you do that? Does that just tie too many of your hands? And similarly, ask the question, what does it do for Uncle Sam? Does it tie your hands too much? Given that a joint strategic framework only lasts as long as it is in fact operationalized, and then all bets are off. But one of the arguments I outline in the book is that from Washington's perspective, this sort of arrangement actually buys time, because the critical question of the Taiwan Straits is to restore deterrence, both from the United States and by the Taiwanese themselves. The Taiwans, God bless their souls, and I was a student there as a kid, I love the place, been there a dozen times over the years, not since I've been Prime Minister, but that's a separate question. Their attendance there in national defence over those decades has been woeful. It's now turned around, thank God. And turned around, thankfully, under the DPP, the centre-left party, in Taiwanese domestic politics, the pro-independence party, and you can see the rationality for that now beginning to happen. But to invest in the sort of asymmetric warfare on the ground, which the Taiwans would need in order to cause the Chinese to conclude that they may face what the Russians face with Ukraine on the ground, which is a bunch of asymmetric weaponry and systems, suddenly creates a massive problem. And remember, you're looking at the largest potential amphibious operation since the D-Day landings, for God's sake. So, very much so, together with the United States itself. There is a counter logic to what I've just said, which others have put to me in other forums. I've just done 3 or 4 weeks launching this book in the United States, because the US and China are my principal audiences for this book. And the counter logic is, well, let's just say, Kevin, we did that, then aren't you therefore saying to Xi Jinping there's a narrowing window of strategic opportunity for you to act? Here is the counter logic to that idea. Not that I've ever studied that level of wargaming before, and game theory. I'll leave that to you guys. You know, it's a lot of fun. But it's along these lines. Militarily, that may make sense. Where it doesn't make any sense at all is financially and economically. Yeah. Because right now, the Chinese system is massively vulnerable to the United States' ability to wield control and influence through the US dollar-denominated financial system. You've seen what's happened with SWIFT and the action on foreign reserves against the Russians. While it would be enormously destabilizing for the system, globally, if you did that to the Chinese, say, next year, it would be crippling for the Chinese economy and financial system as well, and induce massive crises. So that, for me, suggests that the natural timetable in the Chinese mind for moving on Taiwan militarily, at this stage, barring successful deterrence by the Taiwanese and the Americans combined, is late 20s, by which stage they would hopefully, in their judgment, have improved the military balance even further, but more importantly, floated the renminbi, made it a global currency, put it into the foreign exchange baskets of every country in the world, and opened the capital account so they're not held to ransom as the Russians currently are. So that's the interlocking sort of logic behind the idea.
Fascinating. Now, Kevin, this is not a Dorothy Dixer, but I'm going to give a question to Stephen loosely here, and the mic will come for you, Stephen. Just hang on a second.
Kevin, thanks for your remarks. I look forward to reading the book. Is there an alternative scenario to the one you've just sketched? In the sense that if it's reasonable to assume we have been in a second Cold War since Putin recovered Crimea, that the world essentially will split into two camps over the near period of time. The dictatorships, Russia and China, and some of the dumpster despots like North Korea and Syria and so on, in one camp, and more broadly, Western liberal democracies, including the ones in this area of the world, Japan, Korea, Australia, and others. And there will be a clustering in terms of economy, military security, even culture in terms of our values, and there will be a return to two opposing camps that eye each other with great suspicion and try and minimise contact in a lot of areas.
The arguments I advance in the book, Steve, around managed strategic competition assume that that trajectory continues towards a more binary world. But as happened with the Soviets and the United States in the period after the Cuban Missile Crisis, to hopefully put in some guardrails, some rules of the road, which reduce the risk of crisis, escalation, accidental conflict, real conflict, and war. On your broader point about where are we in the, let's call it, the reality of the global order right now, all the trend lines are in the direction that you have just described, but we're not there yet. I think the ideological bifurcation occurred when Xi Jinping became General Secretary. If any of you are China nerds in the room, any China nerds in the room? Wave your hand. No one's self-declaring. Oh, there, go on you, Peter. Read again the most seminal document, which is document number 9, produced by the Chinese Ideological and Propaganda Department in 2013. It's an unvarnished, leaked copy of Xi Jinping's address to that conference about what he really thinks about you and me. And it's not flattering. And if you want to actually have an unvarnished view of the ideological Manichaean struggle between East and West, between our notion of liberal democracy and the Chinese Communist Party and Marxism and Leninism, that's it. So ideologically, I think that trend began there, Steve. I think geopolitically, the headwaters of the bipolar world were consummated on the 4th of February this year with the joint declaration between Moscow and Beijing, simply because of its gargantuan scope and the casting off of traditional Chinese reservations about the Ruskies just being a little too over the top. We Chinese, certainly we're authoritarians, but we're nicer authoritarians in the world. And those Ruskies, well, they go out there and they do thuggish sort of stuff. They shoot down planes, they invade countries, they do what they do in Syria, they do what they do in Libya, they've now done what they've done in Ukraine. But we're on board with that because they're our global strategic partners against Category A, which is the US of A, and those of us who fall within that system of the democratic world's values. I think geopolitically, we should not underestimate the importance of that document. On the question of geoeconomics, which is the third component of, let's call it a binary order, the jury is still out, simply because, unlike with the Sovs, the level of enmeshment in trade, in capital markets, and even today in technology markets, look at Silicon Valley's continued exports of semiconductors to the PRC, notwithstanding the CHIPS Act, notwithstanding what's happening with Fab, with TSMC and Samsung in the United States, notwithstanding the new restrictions concerning what Intel and others do. We're still a ways off that happening, and there are countervailing forces both in China and in the United States on that. So my overall comment would be the jury, therefore, is still out, but it's sliding that way.
So, Kevin, as a career-long strategist, I find my predictive abilities are woeful, and seldom do I get things right. But you've been around the country, not only selling the book, but doing a bit of election campaigning. Who's going to win the election, and by how much?
You mean the 20th Party Congress? I think the Chinese Communist Party will win the 20th Party Congress. I think looking at the entrails, and I've been campaigning in Queensland, New South Wales and Sydney and marginal seats, yesterday in Melbourne, federal seat of Chisholm, and I'm heading to Perth tonight, and then back to Adelaide. I thought I'd retired, Steve. But as you know, we never quite do. My prediction, just looking at the cold numbers, is that you will have a Labor government with a modest majority, and somewhere between 1 and 5 seats. The possibility of a hung parliament, depending on the teal independence, is there, but it is not the dominant probability. It's a possibility. So you can bring me back here and crucify me if I have radically misled all of you. But that's my take of the field 3.5 weeks out from an election, based on what I know now, as opposed to, and what I see now, as opposed to the last couple of weeks of the campaign. We're consistent with history. My party will be accused of destroying freedom, destroying the economy, and destroying the robustness of Australian national security on a regular basis. So whether that swings a vote in the end of the day, we'll see.
Well, Kevin, it's been a fascinating discussion. We could clearly go on for much longer, not only about domestic politics, but also about China. I want to thank you for the insights you've given us, and please, I think, avail yourself of the chance to get a copy of the book. And please thank Kevin.